podcasserole. Welcome in.
You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast, a proud member of the Podcasserole Network. Hello, Jamie.
Look at you in your new glasses.
Actually, these are my old glasses. These are the glasses that I've always used to wear. I got new ones, and I don't know, thinking about coming back to these. But all right, listen, I got a quick story for you.
Okay.
I think I texted you a picture the other day, and I have to decide whether or not I want to actually add it to anything. But I'm sitting down, I'm doing some work. My kid is heading out, and all of a sudden I hear boom, right? And I go out to the front, and I look, and I scream. Oh my! I don't even know what I screamed. I think I just went ah. Jamie, I have an important lesson for you. If you're going to back out of a garage, I highly recommend you put the garage door up first. I mean,
how come?
Seems strange.
Why do you need to do that first?
My 17-year-old tested the theory on what happens if you don't do that and drove through the garage door. So at a gaping hole in the front of my house. Yeah, terrible. And my neighbor, Mark, must have heard me scream because, I mean, he looked so panicked as he ran up my driveway. He's like, everything okay? Everything all right? I heard the scream. I was like, look there. Oh, man. And my kid was he was in shock. And my oldest was like, did you kill him? Because he knows I would have murdered the oldest one. I think I've mellowed by the third one. I just also was in shock.
What was happening to your kid?
He sat in the car and just wouldn't get out yet. I think he was just so mortified.
Yeah.
Anyway. All right, listen. That is also maybe a perfect segue to we have a new sponsor for the program, IXL.
I heard.
Let me just say, because my data actually came in the form of a crushed garage door, like you don't actually need to test it out. It works. Just don't drive through the door. IXL actually gives teachers the kind of useful insights that actually improve learning. Did you know they're used in 96 of the top 100 schools around the nation? And so they help personalize instruction. They close gaps. They'll boost SAT scores, ACT prep. Anyway, they do a lot of custom planning. So you can discover what IXL can do for your school. Nice. All right, listen. Doug Bolton was our guest this week.
Yes.
You've met Doug, haven't you?
Yes. We're asking yes and no questions today.
So, sorry. What was interesting about your conversation with Doug Bolton in times that you've met him? In fact, I've met a couple of people this week that know you, that are excited to be doing some work with you. I had a conversation with some folks who are working on I would say AI-driven, but I would say AI-supported teacher evaluation model to allow. So those guys are super excited to be working with you. And then I said, oh, my friend Jamie. And they said, Jamie? And I said, yeah. I said, he's my co-host on the podcast. He told me he does a podcast with a retired superintendent. That's me. But they were pretty excited.
You've been, the essence of you is just retired superintendent now. Let's see, that's a lot. I would say that I did get to meet Doug and his brother. They both co-presented at a conference that I was at.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, it was really kind of fun. I mean, they kind of tag teamed. They do different work. And I was enamored with, as you probably could guess based on this interview, I was just enamored with Doug. I think his work lines up to you and I, obviously, perfectly.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to have this conversation with you about it. There were so many points that stood out to me as important to note, especially in a time right now where, as educators, I think we are living in a traumatic space.
Yes.
Like public education is not easier right now. It's harder.
Never been harder.
Exactly.
In fact, I will tell you, I was at a conference just this past week, and Angela Duckworth was one of the keynotes. And she paused a couple of times to remind the audience how important it is for us to stand in awe of our teachers, because it's never been harder to be a teacher and a leader in a public school, charter school, any sort of system that is about educating children right now. And so I thought it dovetailed so nicely with what our audience is going to hear when they hear from our guest, Doug Bolton, because everything from embracing connection and really seeking a more regulated community, like in terms of like emotional regulation, taking that time to really connect. In fact, it was re-listening in advance of our call today that really helped me think about how I could be how I can respond better to my kid driving through the garage door. I was just like, there's so many examples like that, the equivalent in schools, whether it's aggressive disagreement based on ideology, based on philosophy of teaching, based on politics, whatever. And like, how do we turn down the temperature a bit and re-engage? And so everything from restorative practice, all this kind of stuff, I was like, oh, this is so perfect based on what I've been experiencing these last weeks.
Can I make one connection? And then I think
please, and then we'll get into it.
Dive into Doug, because and this is toward the end of the interview. But basically, they talk about connection. He talks about connection over punishment. Doesn't mean that there isn't consequence.
There's
right?
a difference, and we should talk about that on the other side.
100%. I just love the idea that when my eldest totaled our car, my job was not to punish. My job, because he was in shock, when I got there, my entire being was about caring for him, making sure he and anybody else that might have been a part of it were okay, and to tell him outright, it's just a car. It doesn't matter.
I'm so glad you said that. I did ultimately get to, my dad always said, you can replace cars. We can replace this garage door. I could never replace you.
Exactly.
And I'm so glad he modeled that for me, because it gave me the words to use for my son.
Yeah.
And we got to humor pretty fast at dinner. It was so great, but it was pretty tough. But okay, why don't we I want to hear all about you and all of that. Doug says, invite instead of
I want to hear all about you, but just not right now.
I'm going to exclude you right at this moment and invite everyone to listen to Doug. And then we'll come back and I can't wait.
Oh my God.
From more. So you've been listening to, or you are listening to, An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I am Peter Stiepelman.
Yeah, I'm Jamie Almanson. You'll hear from me later.
Yes, I promise. We'll see you in a minute. Today on An Imperfect Leader, we are honored to have Dr. Doug Bolton, an esteemed educator, clinical psychologist, and author who partners with school districts to cultivate resilient school communities that really do embed social emotional learning, enhance belonging, and support mental health and wellness. And let's, start there by saying, Doug, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
It's so great to be here, Peter. Thank you for having me.
I'm really thrilled that you agreed to be on our program. You and I, we share a friend, Shelley Berman, and I'm so pleased that he connected us to each other. If it's okay, I'd like to start our conversation about your book, Untethered, Creating Connected Families, Schools, and Communities to Raise a Resilient Generation. Now, for superintendents who really are striving to build school cultures so that they can create opportunities for students, I guess what I'm hoping for is maybe to talk a little bit about your book and an important takeaway that you would hope that they would gain from reading it.
Yeah, so I spent my career working with kids in therapeutic school settings. And as the mental health crisis took hold in our country and actually around the world, people began asking and wondering what was it that we were doing that they could learn from in more of gen ed environments. And as we take a look at the ways that people struggle and the things that help us be resilient, there are a couple of things that showed up in the research and in my own practice. And in order to be fully resilient, in order to support our best mental health, we need really there are three main factors. The first is our ability to make healthy attachments, both with peers and adults, but also to feel connected within a classroom community. The second is our ability to be emotionally regulated, our ability to manage stress and be able to show up as our best selves as often as we can in the face of difficult circumstances. And the third is trauma. And the thing about trauma is trauma disrupts both our ability to form healthy and trusting attachments. And it also really undermines our ability to be physically and emotionally regulated. And what we also know is 2/3 of kids by the time they're 18 will have experienced at least one significant trauma in their lives. The thing about the research that was fascinating for me is that there is one intervention that hits all three of those things, and that is being embedded in a connected and regulated community. It helps us learn how to attach, it helps us regulate, and it helps us actually co-regulate when we're around other people who are regulated. We are more regulated. And what we also know is it not only buffers, but it reverses the impact of trauma. And the thing about schools is schools are communities. And so when we can embed kids in healthy school communities, we can do a tremendous amount of good, both at taking kids who are pretty resilient, making them more resilient, more engaged, and we can also support the kids who are most at risk. Because there's no other community that has kids for 30 hours a week, for 40 weeks for 13 years. There's no other place that has this power to support the wellness of kids. And so that's the whole idea of the book, is then to figure out, how do we create these communities of wellness?
Yeah. So I imagine, in having had an opportunity to read some, is to see that for leaders, as a takeaway, is this isn't a prescribed, this is what you need to do, but rather, here are the elements that you ought to be thinking about as you work with your community to establish a caring and compassionate and empathetic community, one that values and honors anyone who crosses that threshold who comes into your building.
Absolutely. It's an interesting thing when we take a look at the strategic plans of most districts, right? What we know is that a strong community, a belonging community, is the foundation of all of those things. When you've got people who experience belonging, students who experience belonging, their achievement goes up, right? It's essential for achievement. Mental health, behavior problems go down, attendance goes up, right? Our physical health is improved, engagement is improved. And here's the thing, it's not only true for kids, but it's true for every adult in the building. And so as an administrator, my focus has always been, how do I create belonging communities for my staff so that they can then create those communities for their students? It's very hard to create belonging in your classroom if, when you walk into the school, if you feel alienated from your team, if you feel alienated within the school building, it's very hard to create that for kids. And so for me, that's the parallel process, is I try and give the staff what I hope that they can then give to students.
Sure. If they feel valued and honored, it is more likely than not that they will do the same work. They'll feel more equipped or able, as opposed to being so distracted by. Adults also have cortisol running through their systems based on all the trauma and responsibilities that they have in life, that we ask them just to shelve as they enter the room and then navigate and negotiate 30 amazing souls that are in their classrooms. So that's really important. Yeah, I really appreciate that. In fact, in your book, you mentioned Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. I was going to show you, but I don't think I could, because I feel like I mask my background, but I have our kids in front of me.
Yes.
And it's one of my favorites. I mean, because, and in fact, it became our one read with all of our school administrators in terms of seeing every kid as our kid. And so what can we do as a community to make sure and ensure that, regardless of one's circumstances, that every kid is seen and feels that they are a part of our kids. So it was one of our reasons for trying to dismantle pay for play and things like that, because it ought not to be because of your personal circumstances of your parents that you get to really leverage all that the school district can offer for those who have privilege. So I really, when I saw that reference in your book, I really zoned in and was like, oh. So I'm curious, because you've just talked a little bit about the connection that we want among the adults in the building to help support the connection of children in their classrooms and throughout their buildings. And there's this bond with the community at large. And so I'm just kind of curious, some steps or some thoughts that you would hope superintendents might think about as they rebuild. And I say rebuild after the pandemic, I think, is a sort of a demarcation line for all of us in some way, shape, or form, losing our connection to each other, and social media playing a real role in that as well. But so how can they rebuild and strengthen these really vital social bonds within their schools, certainly, and then knowing that they are connected to this external system of their broader community? So that's a real loaded question. If you could just answer that in about 30 seconds.
Yeah, we got that. No, I got you. I think that there's a couple things that come to mind for me and the power of school community for kids and staff. There are a couple of statistics, and the mental health crisis preceded COVID. In the decade before COVID, the symptoms of mental health problems skyrocketed. And one of the ones that was most striking to me and most concerning for me was that the suicide rate for children is 2 times higher when school is in session. And when we take a look at that, and then there was a study where they took a look at pediatric emergency room visits by week. And the contours of that graph completely aligned with the school calendar. It started out in January, and there were negligible mental health intakes for psychiatric reasons in hospitals. Second semester starts and it skyrockets, goes down in the summers, goes up in August, And even in when we get 3 days off for Thanksgiving, it still plummets and then goes right back up for finals week and comes right back down. And so I guess as an educator, that tells me a couple things. One is we are both complicit at some level in the mental health crisis, but it also means we've got some power to be able to do something about it. And so that to me is the most hopeful piece. And when we take a look at some of the changes that have happened, especially as they relate to belonging, I believe that one of the biggest shifts in belonging happened in 2002 with No Child Left Behind. And I don't mean No Child Left Behind has been evaluated and assessed enough, but what we know is it didn't work in the ways that it had hoped to work, number one.
We're going to reconstitute your school and everybody
Right.
has to reapply for their job. That's going to be great for the mental health of everybody. Yeah. Seems like
But it shifted our focus, I think. And I think it was an insidious shift from people to data. And as we focused more and more on the data, we focused less and less on what our basic needs are as people in a community. There's a Goodhart's law that says, once you make a measure a target, it ceases to be a good measure. For instance, one of the examples of this is cardiologists. They started rating cardiologists based on their successful surgery so that they could pair the best cardiologists with the most vulnerable people. But once they got into this system, guess who stopped operating on the most vulnerable people? The 5-star surgeons, because it would ruin their score, right? It would threaten their score. And so all of a sudden, these ideas that are meant to enhance learning end up undermining. And what we know is that there wasn't this skyrocketing in learning. In fact, more schools failed to make AYP as time went on. But we also know that there's a mental health crisis that began to spike. And we also know that teachers started leaving the profession. And fewer teachers are entering the profession than 15 years ago. And so as we take a look at this, what I think happened was we began trying to teach bell to bell. We began seeing school as much more of a place where people have to go, where kids come in and we've got a packet with instruction. And we believed that more equaled rigor. That the place where we got it backwards is that education, learning has always been social. It's always been social. The word pedagogy it speaks to, when you break it down in the Greek, it's a servant and a journey. And the learning happens between the servant walking the child to school, sitting with them and walking back. It's a relationship, it's a journey.
Yeah.
And the same
We
thing-
started to prioritize right answers as opposed to learning as well.
Exactly.
We prioritized coaching for compliance, not as that the interactive relationship that will lift all boats when it comes to supporting each other and learning and being vulnerable. That vulnerability was seen as a weakness as opposed to what we are starting to see, I think, again, is seeing vulnerability as a strength. At least that's the whole premise of these conversations that we have on An Imperfect Leader, is to say, let's embrace our vulnerability and see where we can learn and learn together.
Yes. I love it. And have it be safe to get the
And have it be safe. Exactly.
Yep.
I want to move to the next question because I think it ties into some of the pieces that you're talking about. First of all, the fact that the suicide rate is 2 times higher when school is in session. It makes me think of Brian Elbel is a researcher at NYU with the Langone Center and has been looking at schools that have gone phone free. What does it look like with because he's got a relationship with the Department of Education as well as the public hospitals. So are we seeing that schools that go phone free have fewer children being admitted to pediatric hospitals for mental health needs? It's kind of an interesting study. And so I know that there's looking at this, and it didn't even occur to me that the role of school as either could be, to your point, a great place to look at how we can support kids, because if that's where it's spiking, we can also play a role in supporting kids even better. So the 3 days of Thanksgiving is horrifying just to think about that it drops precipitously in those times, that children feel less stressed when they're not at school. That's dismaying for any one of us who really work on trying to create community in our schools. Just as a reminder, our guest today is Dr. Doug Bolton, esteemed educator, clinical psychologist, author, director of school consultation for Formative Psychological Services. And in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's this dimension, leaders learning work. And inside that dimension, there's this term, systems thinking and system design. And you and I share an affinity for Desmond Tutu's quote, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And when discussing the mental health crisis, you've used that parable of going upstream. And you've alluded to that in the previous questions. And so I wanted to kind of return back to schools. And if in fact a big part of our role in supporting kids is that tier one universal and how we can do that, I imagine in the classroom with class circles or community circles, a restorative justice type of approach builds community. I imagine having, particularly the elementaries, a regular all school assembly where they sing songs together, they learn together, they celebrate each other, they celebrate the adults, they celebrate the kids, community is welcomed in, that all of these embedded into the way that school works is a departure from strategic planning and more about how are we building a community where everybody, we know how we all want to be together. And it's about loving each other. I mean, as silly as that might sound, but Lavelle Brown in Ithaca, New York, who co-wrote a book with our friend Shelley Berman, his whole thesis, his whole premise for how he leads is leading through love. And so I embrace that based on seeing what he's done. I'm kind of curious in the schools that you get to support and the ones that you've observed, how do they approach this as a tier one type of approach of building that community?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's some research. And the thing I love about the research in this area is that none of these strategies takes a whole lot of time. None of these strategies requires money or new things. It's simply a shift, right? And for instance, there's great research on greeting children at the door. And it can be very, this is
the high five, hug,
it can
fist
be verbal,
bump,
nonverbal, right?
Yeah.
But what we're doing is we're making a connection. It can even be when kids are sitting, but we're making a connection. We're making eye contact. And I think, first of all, time on task increases by 20%. And so at the end of the school day, that's an hour of additional time per school day of on task. And they saw a significant drop in misbehavior. I think part of it is we can also, when we know our kids, we can see in a glance they're agitated, something's going on. And that also allows us to check in with them. And so something as simple as being really intentional about, can I make even a micro connection with every child, every class period? That piece is important. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Bruce Perry. He's done a lot of work. He's kind of the leading neuroscientist who focuses on trauma and resilience. And he talks about the 3 R's, that in order to access our best brains, reason, we need 2 things. And this is very parallel to my book. We need to be connected in relationship, and we need to be emotionally regulated. The research on things like mindfulness has been around for a long time, and it's powerful. And yet I almost never see it, because when we're teaching bell to bell, we don't have time for this. But this is the kind of thing that will prep their brains for the learning, right? And can we make sure that what we include in our lesson plans, some way of connecting with someone else in the classroom? I had a principal who was a math teacher say, that's so simple. I used to say to kids, check your answer on the board. What if I just said, check your answer with a neighbor? And I don't care if it may be about the answer, but they may notice a Pokemon sticker on their folder. And all of a sudden they have a quick conversation about a Pokemon.
Yeah.
About Pokemon. And then when they see each other in the hallway, there's going to be a different connection.
Doug, I think about that from a superintendent's perspective, as opposed to having one principal say, this is what's working in my building, but to turn to another principal at the same level and talk about the things that are working, your challenges, those types of things, but allowing them to talk. And then they now have a connection when, I'm going to come visit your school, you come visit my school, or even in these all district meetings, I have someone I connected with, as opposed to feeling so afraid to even raise your hand or say anything because they're going to discover that they made a terrible mistake by hiring you to be a principal. That's the biggest fear.
And this is where psychological safety comes in. And psychological safety, the research I love the most comes from a really unexpected place, which is Google.
Yep. I'm trying to remember her name. Is it MIT or Harvard who did the study? Yeah. Amazing. So tell us.
So what they did was they weren't looking at psychological safety. They were looking at trying to figure out how are teams effective. They were looking at bottom line numbers. Psychological safety just happened to come to the top. And what they found is that psychological safety involved a couple of things, that the teams that did the best, everybody's voice got in the room, right? Everybody had an equal voice on these teams. They followed these teams, 180 teams, 2 years. They were looking at productivity plus people self-report. How did they, and it wasn't every meeting that everybody spoke the same amount, but over the course of the study, everybody spoke about the same amount. And then the other is attunement, that they knew what was happening. They knew one another. They could read one another's expressions. They also knew what was happening to one another outside of school, right? Outside of Google. In team meetings, this is outside of Google. That in a classroom, it's outside of the classroom. What that meant was if you've got a team member who all of a sudden is starting to leave right on time, not stay later, don't volunteer for things as much, and we might think, oh, they're checking out. When in fact, all of a sudden you realize that they're in memory. They've got a parent who's in memory care, and they need to go and care for a parent given that their care situation, it completely changes. But if we don't know each other's stories, then we can't do the work to create safety. One other just thing that I'd like to mention that I think is important, because I do think, and this gets at the restorative piece, how do we create restorative communities? And the thing that really struck me is, can we, when kids struggle, can we invite instead of exclude? Right before, a couple years before NCLB, there was another event that I think really impacted the sense of belonging in our school communities, and that is Columbine. Really changed what it meant to feel safe at school. And for 25 years, one of the main responses was zero tolerance policies. So we've got 25 years, and it makes sense, right? Let's get the scary people out because we'll learn better, we'll all be safer. So we've got 25 years of that research. Here's the problem, is what we found is that what the research really says very clearly is it doesn't work to have zero tolerance policies. When people are struggling with, and this is the Department of the Secret Service are the people who drove a lot of this research, the Department of Education, what they found is it's connecting. When we identify kids who are struggling, it's how can we have them spending more time with their favorite teacher?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And in a school setting, it's to remind people we are not suggesting that there ought not to be consequences.
Right.
Part of the consequence is how do we engage and build a meaningful relationship so that when faced with a similar decision, they will make the choice of connection versus rejection.
Absolutely. I had a superintendent friend of mine, Dan Cates. He wanted to reduce suspensions in his district. And so he created an alternative to suspension, which was join a club. It was brilliant, right? Because what it says is you're struggling. We need you here more, not less. And if there's not a club you like, let us know what you want to do.
We'll start one. I've seen esports really pop up a lot because of the fact that parents would say, he just comes home. It's more likely he than she, but let's say they come home and they play video games all day and they don't care about anyone else. Meanwhile, they're connected with others through the video games. They're all sort of enterprise games where they're playing with each other. Why not have a school sponsored team and then do that together? I've seen that as a great example of seeing connection. That's wonderful.
So my thing is, I do think that there are times when kids need to leave, right? There are times when it's just they're too disruptive in the classroom. Yes, they need to leave. There are times when things are unsafe at school and they need to leave. The question is not whether kids have to leave. The question is, how do we welcome them back? Do we welcome them back shaking a finger and saying it's going to be 3 days of suspension instead of 1 next time?
That's right.
Or are we saying, man, that was a scary moment for everybody. It must have been scary for you, right? We've got to feel you're important to this class. We want you here. We need you here. What can we do to make this better? That becomes the work. So that's when we need to double down and take full advantage of this crisis to know that it's a crisis of belonging, because people don't become disruptive or aggressive or frightening in places where they feel connected.
Totally agree.
So can we then double down on the connection? Because what these moments mean is we're missing something. And that's the best opportunity to say, let's reconnect.
Doug, I'd like to ask you a question I ask every guest who comes on the podcast. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
First of all, I love that. I think that I get skeptical when people call themselves experts, right? There's an embedded humility to this, to understand we are all imperfect, and we are much more empowered to be effective leaders when we can recognize our own imperfections. For me, what that meant was by recognizing the things that I struggle with, I was able to create a team around me filled with people who are better at the things that I'm not good at. So that's one piece. But the other piece that I like about this term, the term mastery came up for me. And mastery is, as I think about it and understand it and have heard it defined, is it's this drive to get better at something that we're passionate about. And to me, that was one of the most exciting parts of leadership. And it still is, constantly figuring out, how can I continue to get better at this thing? It's Pablo Casals who still practiced his music 4 or 5 hours a day at age 73. And he said, I'm starting to see some improvement. But it's that constant drive to want to get better. And so those are the two things that come to mind as I think about the imperfect leader.
So I want to talk a minute about the Mosaic Project. It is one of our favorite organizations and has over 25 years of experience empowering students to really celebrate differences, communicate assertively, and resolve conflict peacefully at their outdoor school. I happen to have experience being part of the Mosaic Project, and so I can absolutely tell you it's an amazing organization. Their innovative SEL curriculum is now available to our Imperfect Leader audience. And so you can get a 10% discount through their new documentary film-based Mosaic Classroom Project. So just let the people know during your onboarding process to receive that 10% discount is to just mention An Imperfect Leader. Learn more about the Mosaic Project at mosaicproject.org.
This is Greg Meyer, Jamie's partner at APC Leadership Collaborative. Superintendents know that school principals are the single biggest lever that any school district has for improving student joy and success. Unfortunately, there's very little professional development for the specific things that a principal has to do to improve their school. At APC Leadership Collaborative, we specialize in coaching principals to take on audacious goals, build their leadership skills, and make big improvements in their school. If that inspires you, let's connect and talk about how we can collaborate. Find APC Leadership Collaborative online at apccolab.com.
When leaders think in systems, they think differently. They see the big picture, making decisions that create coherence and strengthen communication across their teams. They build adaptability, flexibility, and engagement. Every day, school leaders face complex challenges, from student engagement to staff alignment. What if your team could see those challenges as part of a bigger picture? That's what happens when you think in systems. It's how leaders turn complexity into connection and challenges into opportunities for growth. At the Waters Center for Systems Thinking, we help educators and organizations build this capacity, developing the habits and tools that turn vision into action. Think differently, think in systems. Sign up for our webinars, free resources, or a consultation by visiting our website, which you can find in the show notes.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest today is Dr. Doug Bolton, an educator, clinical psychologist, author, and director of school consultation for Formative Psychological Services. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision they made, and then we discuss it. Doug, what happened?
One of the things that happened, I was the principal of a therapeutic school. And therapeutic schools, I think since the beginning of therapeutic school existence, has prided itself on strict behavioral structures, getting the menus of punishments and incentives and we were effective as a school in a lot of ways. But as I started doing more research and as I started watching the people who were most effective at doing the work with kids, it was very different than the typical behavioral models I had grown up with that I think are still embedded in our schools, our parenting, society in general. And in fact, what the research would say is that behavioral models suggest that behavior is based on motivation, and we just need to change the motivators. But I'm motivated not to yell at my kids, and I still yell at my kids, right? There's something that's still, when you really take a look at it, it doesn't make a lot of connection. And so again, what we found is that a lot of the behavior we were seeing was dysregulated behavior. And Stuart Shanker's research, for instance, says misbehavior is stress behavior. So instead of figuring out what punishment we need to give to keep this from happening again, or what incentive we need to give the question is, how can we understand and identify the stress? and help the student reduce that stress.
So then what'd you do?
So that was the problem. So I thought, all I need to do is give everybody this research, and everybody will just jump in line and say, let's do it differently. And it didn't happen that way. And I was surprised that the resistance to it showed up in a couple of different places. People would say, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then when they were faced with a student who was struggling, when they would become dysregulated themselves, they would want the pound of flesh. And I think one of the things that I found is that the data, just telling people this is good for everybody, doesn't do it. And the Dan and Chip Heath's book, Switch, is a good resource for really thinking, how do we change what happens for people emotionally? But I was just trying to speak to their brains and
Right.
hearts.
And it also seems, I mean, the way I'm hearing your description, so you have this leadership role and you want to shift the way that the community understands and responds to student behavior, to child behavior. I won't call them students. That seems like to depersonalize the fact that every child is an individual.
Absolutely.
So, and as you're describing it, it made me think of this iceberg model that systems thinkers use as they think through. So responding to the events that we see as opposed to really getting to the base of that iceberg and understanding the beliefs, principles, and values that people bring to the work, because that influences how they behave. And you're almost going to, I want you to change the way you are acting without first maybe going to, let's discuss and unpack your belief system about children and their behavior. Does that seem appropriate with what got overlooked?
That's exactly. And we were successful before we made these changes, but I think we were successful in spite of, not because of, a lot of the things that we were relying on. So what we realized was when kids were struggling, we'd put them with the people who were who were able to connect with these kids the best and who were most regulated. And so we were shifting to a regulation model. But what I found was that whenever there's change, there's going to be lightning rods in that change process. And the lightning rod, I thought the lightning rod would come towards me. So I thought, okay, I'm not getting it. Who got it was the dean of students. And so he was the one who was best at this stuff, right? This was the message he had been preaching all along. So I felt like this would be empowering for him. Person after person would really vilify him for not being able to provide the punishment that was necessary, that not believing that regulation, helping the child regulate, then they could access their best brains. And then we problem solve with the teacher and help figure out what's going on, that didn't feel sufficient enough. The other thing that began to happen was that people began doing workarounds. So we didn't want kids to be isolated in quiet rooms anymore. We called them quiet rooms. A kid behaves poorly, we send them to the quiet room.
Yeah, we called it a think and plan room. Let's think
exactly.
And plan.
So
TAP for short. Let's go to the TAP room.
Yeah. And these are all euphemistic. But really what they would do is they would become more regulated because of the time. But then we'd leave them in there after they were regulated for hours, right? And so we said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. But then they created another system and created another room called the Opportunity Center. So then so it was a little bit like, oh, so there are these workarounds that these are the ways that people were invested in resisting the change that I didn't see coming. And I still feel badly because I think if I had seen that coming, if I could have been the point person for those challenges, I would have put myself in those shoes better. But instead, it was very stressful for the people who were.
So one of our questions is, what could you have done differently? And so you've just stated it. Was there an opportunity? Did you have weekly meetings with your dean that just failed to think about that, or to ask, how's it going? And they didn't want to overburden you because they had a job to do, or I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think he was the one who was always in the moment, right? So we would talk about it quite a bit. I think what I realized was I didn't articulate the vision well. I articulated the data, but I didn't articulate the vision. And part of it was because I wasn't really quite sure where we were going at some level. What I knew was we needed to change, and I had a vision for what that looked like. But I didn't express it as clearly to my team. One of the things that we began doing was saying, we didn't know exactly where we were going, but we said, we're starting in Chicago and we're heading west. And it began, there was this kind of organic process where it's like, it looks like we're going to California, right? And then as we get closer, it's no, we're San Francisco, no, San Diego is where we're headed, right? So it became more and more in focus. But I think one of the things that I learned that I struggled with was being able to take, I believed was clear data, right? And a clear vision, and assuming that everybody that one PowerPoint in a staff meeting at opening day,
You're like, nailed it.
followed up emails, right? And
Yeah.
everybody's saying, great. But then really not, as things began to struggle, being able to restate that vision, given the data that I was coming through, adapt my vision, and then restate it, given the data that we were getting. And so we ended up, it took longer. We got there. I think everybody, at one point, people like, we made it San Diego. This is it. We walked through the halls and this is what it's supposed to look like. But that was 5 or 6 years later. And I think it probably could have been a 3 or 4 year process.
It makes me think of, I similarly had my first meeting as a superintendent with all 150 of our administrators and declared, here's where we're going. And here are our 8 goals, and which when you're focused on 8 things, you're focused on nothing. And I didn't even have a PowerPoint. I was so proud of myself for having memorized, this is where we're going and this is what we're doing. And then why aren't we going to your, I thought we were heading to San Diego. People were like, oh, I thought you said, I don't know.
You were going somewhere warm.
San Juan Obispo, Santa Ana. I remember the sand part. I just didn't know where we were going. Which saint? And so I totally hear your experiences. It resonates. I recently had a conversation with a Kentucky superintendent who gave me wisdom that I wish I had when I first started as a superintendent or as a principal, which is these 45-day plans that are not strategic plans. They're simply, we agreed what we wanted to achieve together, and we'll never get there for just testing. But if we go 45 days and then say, what did we achieve? Did we achieve it? And did it get us the results we had wanted to get? And if yes, great. What's next? Or if no, okay, what do we have to adjust to keep moving ourselves in that direction? And so maybe in those first 45 days from your example would have been first establishing our compelling purpose. And then 45 days later, let's do some reading around what we said we wanted and what the data say. And then the next 45 days, what might be some of our first plans of action, and coming back to say, are we on our way to San Diego kind of thing.
That's right.
And I'm like, oh man.
These bite-sized.
Yeah. It seems so simple. And for those, and much of our audience are aspiring or new to the field. And if we know that nationally we're losing folks after 3 years, a big part of that is no one really teaches us how to do that kind of work, how to lead large systems. And so your example is just wonderful. Thank you.
The other thing, if I could have done it differently, I might have piloted this in a couple of classrooms, because I think it's wonderful when you can get a couple of people who are all in, so that when things aren't working, they can work through those problems.
True.
As opposed to doing that with everybody. And then when you run into a problem, people say, that just doesn't work. As opposed to, no, how do we keep going in spite of the fact that, like, how did this not work? And really struggling in those ways.
Yeah. And then that coaching is peer coaching.
Exactly.
Learning together.
And the energy comes from, oh, how did they do that? I want more of that. And the support for this comes from colleagues and doesn't feel as top down.
In the end, what would you say was something that was good that came out of this?
Yeah, I think that there was a shift for kids, for families, for staff that is consistent with best practice now. I feel like we were ahead of the curve on a lot of these restorative practices pieces.
Sounds like it. Yeah.
This is exactly the emotional regulation piece. And now what's really exciting is that people are, even when they've left our school, they're going off and creating these communities in other places. And the schools that we partnered with, the districts that we partnered with, became curious about this. And so I think that it's begun to have a nice ripple effect throughout the North Shore of Chicago.
That's your legacy. That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's been really exciting. And it also led to the book, right? Book really kind of is a result of that journey. And this belief that when we can look at challenges, not through the lens of motivation, which then leaves us with two bad options, really, if we want to help kids change and develop, that when we can help them learn how to connect, when we can help them emotionally regulate, and we do that by being embedded in communities. And we're better to do that than our families and our schools. And when we can do that, that kids get healthier just being embedded in these communities.
Well, Doug, that's exactly how I was going to end our conversation, was to reiterate the ability to make healthy attachments, to really emphasize the emotional regulation, and then as well as that connection and regulated communities when it comes to trauma. And more than anything, I loved the definition of mastery that you gave in terms of the drive to get better at something that you're passionate about. You're clearly passionate about the work that you do.
Yeah.
And I am super excited and just thrilled and grateful that you joined our programs. Doug Bolton, thank you so much for being on An Imperfect Leader.
Peter, really grateful for this time, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
Welcome back, Peter. I loved this interview. I think Doug's research, Doug's approach, Doug's calling, it fits so well into who we are as leaders and who we are. I mean, even the word leader here, I would say as educators, as people, and what we think is
as
important.
just human-centered folks. And sometimes I think about the fact that this is a podcast for superintendents and aspiring and those who are in the field and think about the field. To have these leaders who are adjacent at the moment really provides us with professional learning that can upskill us and to challenge our thinking or to remind us why we got into the work. Yeah, I know these are probably not one of the themes that you want to talk about. So if it's all right, I just want to mention, I loved his example of when you say, okay, we're going to put the doctors with the highest rating for surgeries to work with the most high risk patients, and how that sort of policy will backfire because the doctors will begin refusing to work on patients who are high risk because it could damage their rating. And I thought about that with teachers, particularly in states where they rate teachers A, B, C, D, F. And so a high performing teacher in terms of they have had real success in AP courses or things like that. And then they are moved to work with the highest need kids. And because you may know your content at this highest level may not make you the best teacher for a kid who, if you're not trauma informed and I thought to myself, oh, there's some real similarities here. It's like putting a high performing principal in a high risk school. Well, they have maybe no roots in that community. They have had no experience navigating cultural difference. And so they find themselves really struggling. And so they may refuse that. So I don't know. And this has nothing to do truly, with some of the themes that were the big themes, but I love the example he was giving. It just made my brain swim about when we put together a policy to fix something, the quick fix creates an unintended consequence of failure for so many.
He said that, I forget what the name of the law was, but that there's an impact of the measure being the target. So when No Child Left Behind makes the measure the target, it completely shifts how we teach.
Yes, that was the example. Yes, thank you for bringing us back to why he talked about doctors and that kind of thing.
And so my question that I wrote down for him or for you was, how do we turn, quote unquote, I'm petting heavy quotes here. I want to make sure that everybody on the podcast knows that I'm putting heavy quotes around this. But how do we turn 5-star teachers into models for others to learn from and with, in a position that lets them teach the most vulnerable? Like, this is one of the mantras that I have in terms of improving instruction is, you want to get better, partner with the teachers who are better than you. What is better? What does better mean?
Okay. Well, so I want to think about this, and truly I sometimes bristle at the coaching models that schools come up with, putting a 5-star teacher into a coaching role and then sending them into schools as if that's going to fix something.
Yeah, no, that's not what I'm asking.
No,
that's not what I'm asking.
I know. Yeah. Oh, okay. Hold on for a second, because one of the things that it makes me think about is, how do we create a peer coaching model where we can leverage their content expertise and then push that into a teacher's classroom who does have the exceptional ability of connecting with kids who have, in so many ways, written off school. I'm here because I got to be here, not because I want to be here. And there's nothing that you're going to teach me that I'm going to hear. But however, so how do you create those models? And I'm not totally sure, but I got an idea that APC has done some of that work as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is my.
So you have a question for me, but it sounds loaded because you've got an answer.
No, I don't have an answer. I actually do have a question for you. But how do we turn that, given that what he said? And the thing that stood out that obviously that the people on the podcast have heard me say over and over is the power of pedagogy. And he breaks it down to the Greek it's servant and journey. The
Yes.
servant.
Yes.
All right. I love this. The thing that I'm asking that in peer coaching or when we're talking about moving a teacher isn't really about as much about content as it is about pedagogy. And that pedagogy is the ability to teach, how to teach, not what to teach. In fact, he gave a spectacular example later on when he talks about that you'll get more growth from the kid, you'll get more learning from the kid if you, instead of saying, okay, let's check the answer on the board, to check your answer with a partner. And in that checking with the answer with a partner,
Yes.
the kid happens to share something, in this case, about Pokemon. This is the research that we use in terms of our framework by Sharon Ritchie that says that there is basically the person doing the talking is the person doing the learning. And that means kids need to be talking to kids at a higher rate, a higher percentage of time in class than the teacher is talking to kids. Does that mean eliminate the teacher? No. But it does mean that if a kid is talking about Pokemon, there is as much about benefit of them talking to each other about Pokemon as there is about them checking the math problem.
Yeah. In other words, it's not what is the answer, although, I mean, a correct answer is important. It is not what is the answer, but how did you arrive at that answer? It's about exploring the thinking. And so I do think that there are some that are great at it. And I do think that trying to have one coach in a building makes no sense. I do struggle with pulling everybody out repeatedly for professional learning, because when teachers aren't in their classrooms 90% of the time, how do we expect kids to learn? You don't get the same thing with
experience for students when they have a long-term sub. What happens to the experience for those students? Oh, it's terrible. It's not because the long-term sub is a terrible person. Not at all. Low skilled.
Yeah. So when I say peer coaching, I mean there might be a stipend involved, although I don't suspect that's needed, because if you provide the time for teachers to be in each other's classrooms, it's the same thing as when you ask kids to turn and talk and learn from each other. Give the teachers that same opportunity within that space to turn and talk with each other. So what were you thinking about? How are you doing that? And to model for each other. I mean, that is so powerful.
I think the other thing that we're in full agreement. I love this part. I love that reflection that he had. I love that's exactly how we approach it. That's how I have conversations with educators about it. The purpose of the Pokemon conversation is to create that connected community of belonging. It's to diminish the negative attributes. Like when he talked about being in that embedded supportive community, reversing the negative impacts of trauma.
Yes. Yeah. I think you referred to it as attunement. We know each other's stories and recognize what's happening in their lives. Yeah.
Talking about Pokemon for literally what is likely 30 seconds is as good, if not better, than just getting the answer. That now you've got a kid who starts to feel embedded. You embed, they're going to accelerate their ability to take on more difficult academic challenges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This takes me to the comment that he made about mental health and students. And that was the most eye-opening piece. In fact, I shared it with my wife, who's in the health industry. She works at Children's Hospital here in Oakland and in San Francisco that's connected to UCSF. And when I was sharing the data about how mental health issues for children spike when they're in school, with the breaks, seeing them go down and recover, only even in the 3-day Thanksgiving holiday break here that's about to happen, it goes down for 3 days and then skyrockets back up. And it had me, you both really mentioned the power that goes with this, right? Because he says, this is the idea. So much time is spent in school, and I want to come to that idea. But it made me think of, most educators know this quote, but is it Chaim Genot? Is that how you pronounce his name? Do you know this quote?
Say the quote.
Okay. The quote, I have come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It's my personal approach that creates the climate. It's my daily mood that makes the weather. That quote is the power that you have in that space can create the positive embedded community of belonging or the opposite. And I think teachers don't realize that's the power that they have.
That's interesting. Particularly, also think about, okay, so we've just come back from Thanksgiving. I could tell you probably the behaviors right before Thanksgiving were amplified
And the next few weeks before the winter break it'll be hard for some kids. And so this idea that misbehavior is stress behavior. And so then how do you create within your own classrooms, right? And within your own buildings and within your own district, the grace, the response to the kinds of behaviors you're going to expect to see, because food insecurities, housing insecurities, all those kinds of things. If you're a superintendent and you're putting out the message about inclusion and those types of things, or belonging. I mean, I think back to being a principal and walking through a classroom, and there was a teacher asking each kid about what they were going to do for the Christmas break. Half the class were kids of means, half the class were children in public housing. And so it was just so tone deaf to, so you're going to Disney World. That's amazing. Then the next kid over is like, yeah, I'm going to Disney World too, and was not. And another one's, you're not going to Disney World. Like, no, I am going to Disney World. And then it just all devolves into a shouting match and falling apart.
Yeah.
Be mindful of you've heard me talk about the cultural field, maybe ad nauseum, but the cultural field is so important. And so at classroom level, building level, district level, how do you do that work meaningfully?
I mean, that's it. The answer to that question is, I think we both know how to do that work meaningfully. In fact, his after action review kind of reflects on.
Yeah, talk more about that. Yeah.
He knows how to do it. This is what is it, Mike Tyson quote? Everybody's plan is great until you get punched in the face. It's the same. I actually think it's simpler. Everybody's plan is great until people show up. Yeah, I know how to do it. Can we do it within a system of this many people? I have serious questions. As a pessimist, I have serious questions. Do I believe in people? Yes, I do. Do I believe in teachers? Oh my goodness, do I? With every fiber of my being. Do I believe they're in a position that makes it possible to achieve this? No, they're given garbage, and it's getting worse. And so when we started the podcast and thinking about this in relation to the teachers that we know, I'm going to pick up Leo today. I'll pick up my youngest from school. I'll go walk over there and pick him up. I will say I get to see both his principal and his teacher almost every single day when I pick him up. Anyway, I'm going to make a concerted effort to say, I think you're amazing. And I think I really am grateful for the effort and time you put into this.
Truly, for the end result of exactly what Doug has talked about a connected and regulated community, a strong community, one that is embedded and connected, all of those things. I love it. I love it. I just came back from a series of meetings where it felt as if there was, and these were by policymakers that, quite frankly, I don't think they understood how important it was to stand in awe of teachers and recognize their efforts and not ask for more.
I'm so with you. I mean, I wrote So one of my reflections on Doug was that this job is so absurdly hard. Yes, we're underpaid massively. The pool is getting shallower in terms of who we can recruit.
And I'd say this for principals and superintendents who think that superintendents make so much money. I mean, when you divide it up by the hours that they spend, it's not that much. And they're asked to do more and more.
There was one other comment that Doug said that I thought connects to this idea about being supportive to students and this, and talking about clubs, specifically the superintendent that did clubs, not suspensions. And you know what it made me think about is that made me think about collective identity. Like basically they're saying, I want you to feel so connected that when you do take a break, the break itself feels like, oh, I don't want to be away. I want to be in.
Oh, I love it. And, yes, invite in. Jamie, this has been fun.
Yeah, for sure.
You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Please, if you have a chance, give us 5 stars on iTunes. We'd really appreciate that. And in the comments, if you want to tell me about the time that you drove through your garage door or what your most profound...
Peter, when did you drive through the garage door?
I did not drive through the garage door, but I certainly had some of my own stories about a undeveloped prefrontal cortex as a 17-year-old and the car accident I was in.
Good.
And so it really did lower the temperature around the table as we each discussed our different accidents, and to say, you know what, we're so lucky that we came out okay. And you know what I bet will happen next time? You're going to open up the garage door before you leave.
Yeah, we hope so.
I hope so too. All right. You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader. We'll see you next week. Bye, Jamie.
See you next week. Bye.